This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. Warren, if there is a week when we've got a lot to get to, man, we started with a UN panel on climate change, and now we're talking impeachment for the first time since the 90s. We think, maybe not. Impeachment's... I remember, actually, I think it was January, the week of Trump's inauguration in 2016, and a media outlet that I'll leave unnamed, but it's one known for smooth talking and calm, so you can probably guess which one I'm talking about, actually did a serious program, or what came across as a serious program, on the steps to Trump's impeachment. Mm-hmm. And this was before he was actually inaugurated. So this has been something talked about for a long time. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has certainly resisted all cause for that up to this point, probably at some level for some political calculations. And then the week began with a group of 50, I think, House members issuing a call to impeach based on a story that broke this week, and which was followed then by a whistleblower complaint that was released, in which the president, who actually admitted that he pressured the president of Ukraine to look into corruption of the Biden family, specifically Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. And so Nancy Pelosi launched a impeachment inquiry, which, as one news report I heard this week said, is really adding nothing to what's already happening, right? There's a number of investigative committees that are working on various things, but at least it puts it under her influence and her power. So here we go.
Yeah, that's right. Here we go. And you're right. Ever since Trump was elected, they've been talking about the I word. In fact, there have been a couple of I words. You mentioned both of them, investigate and impeach. And the investigation word started showing up more and more whenever the House flipped from Republican control to Democratic control. And of course, it put the committee chairmanships in charge of Democrats, including the Committee on Investigations, Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. So, there's no surprise that the investigations into the Trump administration would be heating up during these last couple of years. I will say I think the impeachment talk is a little bit different because, for one thing, Nancy Pelosi, who has been, I'm not a fan of hers, but you've got to admit, I think even those who don't like her have to admit that she's a pretty clever political operator in Washington, D.C. And, the fact that she is now using the I word, the impeachment word, and not just the other I word, the investigations word, I do think probably means that something has changed here in the conversation.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what that is. And something happened, clearly, because she went from no to yes over a weekend. I mean, really, I think it was just last Friday when she said that it was still off the table. And then was it midday Monday or Tuesday where she said it's back on? Yeah,
the transcripts were released on Wednesday, so I do think it was Tuesday or Wednesday that happened. But
I know she did it before the transcripts officially were released, and that was one of the questions.
Yeah, so, and a lot of people are saying, a lot of Republicans, a lot of Trump supporters are saying that, no, Pelosi and the Democrats, they're overreaching here. And that could be, because that's what happens when parties get in power. That they let that power go to their heads, and they tend to overreach, and that's what allows the other party often to come back. I would have to say, though, that in this case, it'd be very dangerous to count Nancy Pelosi out. She's, like I said a moment ago, she's a very clever political operator. A lot of folks think she's the smartest political person. She has the sharpest political mind in Washington, D.C., and I don't say that either as a compliment or an insult necessarily.
Yeah, that's not necessarily a character quality.
But it probably is true. I mean, she was Speaker whenever Trump, whenever the House flipped to the Republicans. She was not a Speaker, and usually what that means is you're done. But whenever the Democrats took over again, she was back, back from the dead and ready to party, as they say. So, yeah, she is a political operative not to be discounted.
Yeah, I think that's right. And she's got a lot of things to deal with within her own party. And, I don't want to turn this, however, into just a purely political discussion, as tempting as it is, right? Because those are really interesting details. I mean, she's got a real divided party on her hands and heading into an election season, and this is something that is going to unite them. On the other hand, one of the most entertaining incidents of the week was Joseph McGuire, the acting director of national intelligence, finding himself 6 weeks into the job subpoenaed. He said, I think that's probably a new record. And when they asked him about the whistleblower complaint, he said, if I had heard about this, I would not have taken the job. So that poor guy looked like a deer in the headlights, and like he caught he was the dog who finally caught the car and not sure what to do with it. That's going to be an interesting part of this as well.
Well, that's right. And, John, you mentioned a few moments ago that it is easy to sort of just get entangled in the spectacle of the thing, that it's just entertaining and you just might want to watch it. But I think you're right. As Christians, we should not do that. I mean, we should care. We should pay attention. But we should be, I think we should also care mostly about things like the rule of law and process and, Constitution being upheld and praying for our leaders, whether we agree with them or not, that justice would be done here, that there are worldview issues at stake here. There are questions of, I guess you could say, transcendent importance, shall we say.
Yeah, that's right. Trying to think about what to say. Actually, I had somebody text me on the way into work on Friday saying, I was wondering if you'd actually tackle the impeachment question. Glad to see you did. And I appreciated that nice comment, although I kind of cheated. Because, look, it's too early to really know where this is going to go, to even know the details, to know the level at which this, was. Quid pro quo. There's just so many different aspects to this story, and it's premature for anyone who says this is what's going on. Some of the things that are going on in terms of, we have two sides that really, really don't like each other and moving forward. But what I did is I went back and spent the week looking through a series of Breakpoint commentaries that Chuck Colson did. And he had, back in the 1990s when Clinton was facing impeachment. And, of course, he has a unique perspective. Not only did he always bring a robust Christian worldview, but he lived through some pretty challenging times in the Nixon administration. And one of the things that he said is kind of a step back from the impeachment proceedings themselves or the impeachment inquiry, which is what cultural context is this being lived out in. And one of the things I was struck by is he related that even when he was facing the grilling that he did in front of Congress for his involvement in Watergate, and he knew, this isn't going well, the president's time is done, and he realized all that, he still was encouraged by the process. He was still encouraged by the statesmen who were willing to put aside partisanship, including the Republicans at that point, because what was at stake, as you said, were things bigger than my side or your side. And he said that wasn't the case when it came to President Clinton. And I think he was right. There was a stark difference in the kind of the level of civic education we have. There was a stark difference in the level of national loyalty versus political ideology. I think there's a stark difference in the moral formation of a culture, both the ones that are, in play right now and the rest of us watching. Yep. And, Solzhenitsyn and Warren that the sign of a decaying culture was a lack of great statesmen. And if it's the case, I doubt that most Americans think, oh, these guys have the national interest in mind over their political agenda. I don't have that confidence. Do you have that confidence?
No, with some I do. But no, not as much anymore. There's no doubt about that. But John, you said you cheated by going back to the old Chuck commentaries. But
by the way, that's our Colson Center cheat code for all you gamers out there. Is what would Chuck say?
Yeah, what would Chuck say? But I got to tell you, you call it what you will. I don't call it cheating. I call it a really beautiful opportunity for us to curate some of that old wisdom that Chuck brought to us, 20 years ago that's still very relevant today. And I really appreciated actually sort of hearing Chuck's voice, sort of from decades past, literally saying things that were just so spot on and relevant for what's happening today.
Yeah, and that happens to us over and over and over. And I think we'll continue to look at that as the story unfolds. If you come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link you to Friday's Breakpoint so that you can read Chuck's words or listen to Chuck's voice. And so you don't miss a single commentary, subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast, and you'll catch this conversation each and every week that we call Breakpoint This Week, where we look at the stories of the culture from a Christian worldview. And you'll catch each and every Breakpoint commentary, which goes out 5 days a week, 3.5-minute commentary on some story of the day, bringing in a Christian worldview perspective. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Warren, we just finished talking about how the week kind of transitioned about midweek and where we're at now. But beginning of the week also featured an interesting incident where a 16-year-old high school student was a featured speaker at the United Nations.
Well, it was an interesting moment because she, as you said, is 16 years old, Greta Thunberg, and she describes herself, in fact, as a 16-year-old climate activist with Asperger. And it made it hard to criticize what she was saying because you would come off looking like a bully if you did. And that, of course, also spawned a sort of a whole subspecies of comments about the progressive left. Anytime they want to put outrageous arguments out into the public square, they'll just hold up a child to make those arguments for them. The Babylon Bee, for example, did a really funny cartoon about that. But it's a serious issue, and it's a serious, I think, turn that our political conversation, that our public conversation has taken, which is this turn from coming to the public square with a perspective, but backing up that perspective with an argument, with a case, from that to now where it's all about emotions. It's all visceral. It's all about a 16-year-old girl who will stand up and essentially rant at her adults. And it has changed the nature, or it threatens to change the nature of political conversation in this country. And since this took place at the United Nations, I might even say political conversation around the world.
Yeah, well, it was. And, this story goes back several years where this, at the time, 14-year-old went on a hunger strike to protest climate change. Just culminated last Friday, something we talked about, which was this kind of climate change walkout. And then Monday, Greta Thunberg is in front of the United Nations. Now, here's the connection that I make. Is this the kind of ultimate triumph of the cult of adolescence? Think about the Parkland High School shooting, and you had a group of students who survived that horrific incident and came out and now are national leaders from the gun control side, and certainly were. And listen, I don't begrudge young people an opportunity to lead. And I want to be really careful how I say this. My problem with Greta Thunberg or the Parkland students isn't that they're 15, 16, 17 years old. I think for far too long we've embraced this idea that from 13 to now 30, we expect young people to lose their minds and act like idiots and not care about anything important. That was the Gen Xers. That's not the Gen Zers. The Gen Zers are very activist in their work. So I think adolescence, and I've written about this in A Practical Guide to Culture, is a completely fabricated stage of life. It sells young people short. We treat them as if they're children. We don't expect them to grow up, which is an ironic thing when you juxtapose that to how early we steal kids' innocence with pornography and hypersexuality and having them question their chromosomes and all kinds of things. But instead of asking them to grow up, it's now we've embraced a group of activists, and it's okay. It's like, well, it's okay for you to think like kids, but then lead. It's kind of the ultimate triumph. So remember the Parkland, after the Parkland shooting, the town hall, in which a high school student just on national television, celebrated by many media outlets, including CNN, basically cussed Marco Rubio out. And that was considered a heroic event. I don't begrudge Greta Thunberg the opportunity to speak in front of the UN if she has something to say. But she didn't. Yeah. She screamed. She literally screamed. And she chastised adults. And listen, if somebody doesn't deserve respect, I understand the tone and the anger, even though I think she's wrong. But that's the point. She didn't bring a single data point to it other than, Time Magazine's, what they did last week, which is the science is settled.
Well, I think that's right. And, we've written a good bit about that this week. I know I wrote a column, and Roberto Rivera, one of our colleagues, wrote a column for the website as well that dealt with some of these issues. And in my column, I actually say, God bless Greta Thunberg. I mean, I agree with you, John. I think this this false adolescent period that we've kind of created in the last 40 or 50 years in this country and now around the world is exactly that. It's false, and that we should expect more of our young people. So I'm glad that she is speaking out.
But we continue to have low expectations on the thought process.
That's exactly right.
That's my problem, right? Is like, I don't want them to have low expectations. I think we penalize young people with low expectations, and so now we're propping them up because they have a lot of followers on Instagram. but not actually expecting them to grow up in their thinking and in their argumentation.
Right. And not only that, I think in this case, adults are using her for propaganda purposes. I think that's a part of this story that that also disturbs me as well. Listen, you don't get to speak before the United Nations unless a whole lot of adults have cleared the path for you in that process. And the same thing with the Parkland shootings as well. I mean, there was a certain sense where the media just descended on that, and that might have happened by itself. That's sort of organically. But the thing that I think is particularly disturbing is when you've got adult ideologues who have not been able to make any sort of headway with their actual arguments, with their logical arguments, and then they start holding up children because children are difficult to criticize, and that's the way that they make any sort of headway that they are making in the public square with their propositions.
Yeah, so adolescence starts as this kind of stage of life, and one of the things we talk about in A Practical Guide to Culture is that it's become the goal of life. And this wouldn't even nearly be as concerning to me. It would be a one-off kind of situation if so many of our public debates weren't already ruled by emotion instead of argument, ruled by kind of hype instead of facts. And to me, it's not ironic at all, and not accidental, that on the weekend before she appears before the UN on Monday, the weekend before, Time Magazine puts out this hyperbolic edition that's, again, kind of the same level of argumentation. From the very beginning, they say, we're not taking another side to account. The science is settled. And it doesn't matter how many scientists say, no, wait a minute, it's not settled. And you've written about that, and you've done a great job. And I want to make sure everybody knows about the 5-part series that you wrote, which you can find at breakpoint.org. Again, click on the button there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we will link you to a terrific 5-part series that Warren Smith wrote on the issue of climate change, including this article from this past week on Greta Thunberg. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Stay with us.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Welcome back to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. And John, there are two stories that maybe I'll just mention together because I think they kind of go together. They're sort of twin indicators of what's going on in the culture. The first one relates to Barbie. Creativity is a big selling point for toys these days, so it's not surprising that Mattel, a big toy maker, would want to get creative in the way it presents its dolls and other toys to the public. But what they have done has been to create shall we call it a gender-neutral Barbie? They are saying that they're describing as they don't want to produce toys dictated by gender norms. This line of Barbies and other toys allows kids to express themselves freely, which is why it resonates so strongly with them. We hope Creatable World, this is a spokesperson for Mattel, by the way, we hope Creatable World will enable people to think more broadly about how all kids can benefit from doll play.
All right, here's my prediction. I don't usually make predictions on this program, but here's my prediction, all right? Any kid who is subjected to these toys, here's what's going to happen. The boys are going to turn them into superheroes and professional wrestlers. The girls are going to turn them into moms and dads, and they're going to create families because that's what kids do. That's what they're going to do. I have girl toys laying around my house because I had 3 older daughters. That's what my son does. He takes the girl toys and turns them into guns.
Yeah.
And he turns them into clubs. And he turns them into swords. And he turns them into bad guys so that his Spider-Man and Iron Man can beat up on them. And that's how he sees the world, which is very, very different than how others. Listen, kids have to be talked out of gender identity. They have to be talked out of it. But here's the thing, is culture is a profoundly powerful teacher. And that's what we're talking about here is that we've said this a number of times, culture is most powerful not where it's the loudest, but where it just creates norms, where things seem and feel normal. And that can talk us into ways of thinking that are actually against biological reality, gravity, reality itself. That's the power of culture. Now, on the Merriam Webster dictionary story.
Yeah, that's the second story.
That's the second story, yeah. And go ahead and you can describe that one.
Well, yeah, just real quickly, Merriam Webster, the famous dictionary maker, they've been around for, well over 100 years, or maybe a couple hundred years at this point. I don't even know. They added a new entry or a new definition to the pronoun they. They say that it is now a way to refer to a non-binary individual, one who identifies as neither exclusively male nor female, which, of course, the problem here is that they has always been a plural pronoun, and now to be able to use that pronoun as a singular pronoun, that's the real innovation here. And John, for me, this is a classic example of a saying that I've heard you say for many, many years, which is that the problem is that we have the same vocabulary but different dictionaries, and now this dictionary, which has become over the generations the dictionary for many people in the culture, has embraced this sort of alternative meaning of the word, which is a little bit of a turn, I think.
Yeah, I think I need to, by the way, officially clarify that I didn't make that line up, which is such a great line. I use it all the time.
Yeah.
I can't remember who did, so I'm playing by the Rick Warren rule, which is the first time you say something, you say so-and-so says, and the second time you say, well, as I've always heard, and then the third time it's as I've always said. So I'm on to that. It might have been Kevin Bywater from Summit Ministries who first said that. But look, I'm going to maybe surprise you here because, yes, I talked this week on the point about the meaning of words. Chesterton said, look, if words aren't worth fighting over, what on earth would be? Because words are so powerful in shaping reality. This is the part of postmodernism that got it right. The part that they got wrong was that there's not a baseline reality that we can actually know and we need to react to. But the power of words to form our perceptions to the level that it kind of reshapes how we think and what we consider, again, as I said before, to be normal. That's the power that language has. But here's Merriam-Webster's defense, and I want to hear what you think about this defense.
Okay.
The defense is that they don't tell people how words should be defined, that these words should exist when new words or new definitions are added. And here's the quote, that we are always aiming to reflect usage. It's very clear this is fully established in the language at this point. Mm-hmm. Now, it's certainly fully established in college classrooms where on the first day of class, professors are instructed to go around and ask people their preferred gender pronouns. It's certainly established on MTV for all the adolescents that still watch that. It's not firmly established yet across mainstream media, except when someone says you need to call me they, and then media outlets have largely complied, and that includes on both sides of the spectrum, at least politically. Fox News does that as well as CNN. Is that a legitimate excuse for you?
Here's the thing. I think Merriam-Webster is right to say that, listen, we don't decide, what is in common use or not in common use. We just reflect what is in common use or not in common use. But here's where I think that defense is very limited and doesn't apply here, is that I think this is a question that's still being argued about in the culture. I don't think it is assumed. I don't think we have gotten to the point where it is now fully assumed throughout the culture. And I think what Merriam-Webster has done here has shut down that conversation, has shut down, or at least is contributing to the stifling of that debate. We're still having that conversation in the public square. And I agree with you that on, liberal college campuses, maybe this is a subtle question. But it's not a subtle question in the third grade when you're trying to teach grammar to elementary school kids. It's not a subtle question in the 2,000 Christian colleges around this country, or that are still, more or less using historical norms for this kind of grammar and this kind of thinking. So, no, I think this is far from a subtle question. And for Merriam-Webster just to declare that it is a subtle question and that it now reflects a majority norm in this culture, I think they have moved beyond their defense and into the realm of ideology.
Look, almost every chapter, though, of the LGBTQ chapter of the sexual revolution has preempted debate, right? I mean,
That's right.
It's used levers of cultural power to violate things that are observably true and argue that they're not. And that if you say that's true, then you're not wrong, you're a bigot, you're intolerant, you're evil. And that has really kind of shut things down. I was asked this week, and I'm going to close with this. I was asked this week, what should we do as parents on a weekly podcast that I do with World Magazine called The World and Everything in It. And my argument is this. If we allow things that ought not be normal to be seen as normal, especially when we talk about our kids and grandkids, then we've dropped the ball. Mm-hmm. And that's the danger. Francis Schaeffer talked about this line of despair where cultural elites, especially academic elites, come up with these ideas, embed them into the academy. That trickles down into the arts and education. That trickles down into popular culture, including fashion and movies and music and so on. And then it just seems normal. And that's the thing. I think there's a lot of parents that let these things go by. And there's obviously an age appropriateness here, so let me be careful to say that. But I think there's a lot of parents and grandparents that let these things go by, hoping their kid won't notice. And I want to take an opposite tack. I want to take the tack saying, if your kid doesn't notice, that's because it seems normal. You've seen this shift from what used to be normal to what is now. Your kid hasn't. They're the fish that don't know they're wet. They're swimming in that water. They don't know anything else. And they need to know that even though that is a normal part of our culture, it's not normal. It's not right. And you got to have those really hard conversations. I hope that the book that Brett Kunkel and I wrote, called A Practical Guide to Culture, can help parents have some of those conversations, because we got to.
Amen, John. Absolutely.
Well, thanks for listening to Breakpoint this week. It was great to be with you each and every week as we talk about the issues of the culture from a Christian worldview. Come to breakpoint.org to find the different resources that we mention on today's program. And please subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to rate it and review it and share it with your friends. For Breakpoint this week, I'm John Stonestreet along with Warren Smith. We'll see you next time.